And Liberal MP Andrew Laming, thank you both for your time.
Afternoon.
Sure.
Now, we've got some pretty controversial protests happening this weekend. Indigenous community leaders are really fired up about this Black Lives Matter movement, saying that it should be drawing focus back on a very checkered history of Indigenous Australians, in particular the number of deaths in custody. Andrew Laming, I'll start with you first. Do you think it is appropriate to have these protests this weekend?
Annalise, it's a terrible time for protests, but we also have to be sensitive to just how strong the feeling is around these matters. It's easy for us to say protest virtually. It's also of note that overseas the target is very much law and order. So as soon as we introduce law and order to enforce things here in Australia, we're going to have the same risk of inflammation. Now, we're not going to get pushed around by protesters, but I'd like to think that states can come to some sensible alternative. We have people gathering in Westfields all over the state and all over the nation. If there is a way of sensibly conducting a protest under COVID-safe conditions, I'm challenging our state leaders to do that. I think we have to work with these highly, highly sensitive matters at the moment. All of us are absolutely committed. We're unified on the horrific nature of what we've seen overseas. We'd never want that to happen here. But if people are going to be protesting and it breaks COVID rules, they can expect to face law and order. I just hope that leaders can find a sensible solution that allows a safe way of expressing those emotions.
Josh Burns, do you think there is a safe way, and should we be telling Indigenous leaders to do that?
Look, it's a really good question, Annalise, and I think I would agree with Andrew on that we need to accept that there's racial inequality in Australia and there's systemic racism in Australia. The incarceration rates for Indigenous Australians, the deaths in incarceration is a deeply troubling issue and something that we really need to confront as a nation. But I'm worried about the fact that if we all gather together during this coronavirus, that we're actually putting at risk the lives of the people that we want to stand in solidarity with. And we have done an outstanding job as a country trying to protect people in remote and vulnerable communities, especially in Northern Territory and parts of WA. But the idea of gathering thousands of people during this pandemic puts lives at risk. And I really wish there was another way, and I wish that this pandemic wasn't before us. And if it wasn't before us, I would 100% be joining the protesters on the weekend. But I think we need to do the responsible thing, which is actually the really difficult thing, by not going.
We've heard just the clearest of advice from the Chief Medical Officer as well as the Health Minister that lives will be at risk if people do go out to protest, that in particular it could be catastrophic for Indigenous communities. Andrew Laming, do you support Gladys Berejiklian going to court to try and stop these protests happening?
That's a very hard-line approach, and I suspect that it's going to lead to an inflammation of the situation, self-evidently. The police and those that consider the permissions for protests are able to have a really, really compassionate discussion with these groups. It's very hard to work out, first of all, where they're planning on meeting, how many people they're talking about. But look, we absolutely understand that under COVID conditions at the moment there is zero congregation. But people have expressed protests in before. I mean, the Latvian and the Baltic states formed a human chain of people, all 2 metres apart, right from one end of the country to the other, with zero congregation. There are ways of decongregating and expressing that view. And I think if Indigenous organisers, if that's who is organising the protest and law enforcement can find a way through, we need to work towards that. I mean, the last thing we want is to keep escalating these matters, and every Australian would agree we don't want what's happening in the US happening here.
When you get big groups of people out together, though, it's almost impossible to be keeping 2 metres distance in between each other. Someone needs to go to the bathroom, you're crossing through, all of a sudden you're all cramming into public transport to get there or to leave. Josh Burns, do you think that that is a realistic thing to ask protesters to go out but stay distanced?
It's obviously a really difficult thing to ask people to do, and I'm not convinced that it can be done safely, and that's why I'm not going. But not for a second do I underestimate the pain that people are experiencing right now, not just in the United States, but in Australia. We've seen a void of leadership in the United States. We've seen the United States go through a period of economic devastation compounded with the fact that the United States leadership is looking to divide the country instead of unite the country. And tensions are at a absolute boiling point, and obviously people in Australia are rightly feeling frustrated as well. And I recognise that, and I wish there was a way in which we could stand in solidarity with them on the weekend in a safe way. I just think that at the moment, with this pandemic, we have put ourselves in a wonderful position where we are in somewhat control of this thing, but it can get out of control. And the last thing I would want is the protests having an adverse effect on the very people that we want to be standing in solidarity with.
Now, the government's announced these stricter laws in relation to foreign investment. It gives the Treasurer a lot more power to be able to say no to deals that could be at risk for Australia's sovereignty. It's raised the discussion around the Darwin port and why that was allowed to be sold to a Chinese company in the first place. Andrew Laming, do you agree with these new restrictions being put in by the government? Do you think it's going to perhaps affect the amount of investment coming into Australia?
Big time supporter, Annalise, and it won't affect it at all. We can see there'll be some processing delays if suddenly the government is looking at everything down to a zero threshold, but they'll be prioritising what makes a difference for the economy and jobs. Look, I think deep down Australians from the west to the east coast are worried about some of our most important assets being picked off at fire sale prices. That's probably the gut reaction that we have, and we just want to make sure that all of these transactions are monitored by someone like David Irvine and his group at FIRB. So often we've seen decisions go to FIRB, but there's been a threshold issue where a number were under that amount. That gets fixed. I think even Josh would agree that in this short period during COVID instability, plus these increased sensitivities around trade investment, it's probably a good thing to have every single deal monitored, but prioritising so the important stuff that affects and helps the economy gets through first.
Josh, do you agree?
Look, I think we'll look at the legislation when it gets presented to the Parliament, and I think that the point's obviously been made that Scott Morrison himself was involved in the sale of the Darwin port, and obviously that annoyed his Prime Minister at the time, Malcolm Turnbull, who he was ambitious for, when the President of the United States, Barack Obama, issued a pretty direct warning saying that they should have given the United States a heads up, given the United States has so much activity with Darwin and uses that port just near their military organisation. So I think, obviously with foreign investment, this needs to be done in a way that expresses and exercises our national interests. I think that's an entirely unremarkable thing and one that the Labor Party supported for a long time. I don't see the economic plan that's going to get us out of this recession. And I don't see the way in which Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg are going to extract the deep recession that we're in and the huge unemployment that Australians are facing. And I'm not sure that this review will do much to help it.
Look, when it comes to that move out of the recession we are now in, as the Treasurer has acknowledged, what's the perception from you two about JobKeeper? Should it be extended beyond that 6 months? And also, should it be restricted perhaps? Because there is concern that some small businesses will continue to be taking it after their income has gone up enough. Andrew Laming, do you think it should be open for JobKeeper to be removed early?
I've made plenty of comments about that. We're pretty certain JobKeeper will go all the way through to September, despite the 3-month review, Annalise, that was going to look for any loose ends that needed tidying up. And in fact, the Treasurer's already done that about a month ago when it came to 16 and 17-year-olds on JobKeeper. But what I suspect will happen, and I've put this out publicly, is that we do need to look at remittances of BASs by different sectors to identify which ones are back on their feet. It'll be very obvious to the ATO which ones are trading even higher than pre-COVID levels, and I can name a couple of those sectors. They will be the first to be under review, I suspect, and there's others where people are saying it would just be boneheaded to end this support in September. I'm sure you can imagine travel, major conferences, travel agents, tourism, anything to do with international travel or large congregations absolutely stopped. So those areas are most likely to need protection for longest. And the great thing about it is the ATO has that month-by-month data rolling in, ready for analysis. I think that's a good way of taking it. And there's more complicated solutions as well, where we identify that some people who might have only been doing 4 hours a week may then fall back to smaller quantums of JobKeeper. That's a highly complicated alternative, has been promoted by another political party. I think the former is way more likely, watching sector by sector to identify when recovery is confirmed.
Josh Burns, do you think the government should be open to pulling JobKeeper sooner if they need to, or extending it as well?
Well, I certainly don't agree with the growing number of coalition backbench MPs who are calling for the scrapping of JobKeeper. We heard whispers of that in the last parliamentary sitting, and they haven't gone away. The other thing I would say is that I'm not sure how many more warnings the government needs on some of these key industries that are absolutely on their last legs. The university sector, in Victoria alone, we had major universities on the brink of collapse. The arts and entertainment sector is desperate for stimulus and for government support, and they are being left behind by the government. Casual workers and obviously those in the tourism and hospitality industry are really suffering at the moment. There are too many people who have been left behind by this government. And the RBA itself said that the JobKeeper probably needs to be extended, and we don't have a plan to get ourselves out of the deep economic recession that we have right now. What is Scott Morrison's plan? He doesn't have one, and right now we're leading towards an economic cliff. Things are already bad, but they're going to get worse under Scott Morrison.
And just finally, one of the things that the government says is going to get us further away from that economic cliff that you're talking about is this building program announced yesterday. Hundreds of millions of dollars to help people have renovations on their homes, but there is some pretty tough restrictions on it. You have to be spending over $150,000. Your property has to be worth about $750,000 or less. Andrew Laming, is this too restrictive to really make any difference?
Not at all. This has been designed intentionally, specifically to be transient and targeted at big resi construction that's fallen in a hole. And I think the confusion here, Annalise, is that for 2 weeks the media's been talking about a reno grant where everyone thought they could replace the timber on their deck. This is not about small renos because that sector's actually higher than it was pre-COVID. Everyone's gone home, cocooned and started spending on their homes. We've got Bunnings 40% up, we've got paint sales doubling. This is not about small renos. They don't need help. What's needing help are the large projects that stopped back in March because local government stopped assessing them, everyone worked from home and confidence disappeared for big investment. So this $750 million is about new build or rebuild. It's not renovation. It's if you're knocking something down and starting from scratch. That's why it's restrictive, because not many people do it. This will be 20 or so thousand new people who aren't necessarily first home buyers going out and buying a home that otherwise wouldn't have. And it's all those major renovations, the big rebuilds that are on ice and were never going to happen, suddenly moving forward. Probably only 50 to 100 per federal electorate. But that's enough with the multiplier effect to see possibly $5 to even $10 billion back into that sector that was warning of a cliff just a month ago. And I have to say, Josh, you've got to admit, this could well be the targeted solution to one of the biggest concerns we had about the economy.